You think time is the one thing nobody has to teach you, because it teaches itself through hunger, aging, distance, and loss. You learn it when a song ends, when a face changes, when a season slips away without asking. Time feels like the floor under every thought, so you build your life as if the floor must be real. Yet the more carefully you listen, the more time sounds like a report, not a substance. Most people do not notice the report, because the report is constant. You wake, you move, you remember, you plan, and the mind stitches the sequence into one seamless ribbon. But the ribbon is not the same thing as the thread that made it. The ribbon is what continuity feels like from inside a system that cannot hold every possibility at once. Physics has its own confession buried in its arguments. In relativity, time does not stay the same when you move, and it does not stay the same near mass. Two clocks can disagree and still be correct, which already breaks the idea of one universal flow. In quantum theory, time is often treated like a silent background number, useful for calculations but not something a particle carries. These two languages describe the same reality and still cannot agree on what time is. That mismatch is not a minor academic problem, it is a warning. When you try to describe the entire universe as one closed system, the equations stop talking about change. The universe, seen from the outside, begins to look stationary, like a complete object rather than a running movie. If that is even partly true, then the flowing time you feel cannot be a universal ingredient. It has to be something the inside generates. This is where people jump to the easy phrase and damage themselves with it. They say time is an illusion, and they use that sentence to float above responsibility, grief, and the weight of consequences. But illusion is the wrong word if you want clarity instead of escape. A shadow is not an illusion. It is a real effect that appears when light meets a blocking shape. Time can be like that, real as an effect, not real as an independent substance. To see the difference, you must notice what you actually perceive. You never perceive time directly, you perceive difference plus a trace. You see a changed state, and you also carry a record that another state existed just before it. Without that record, you would have change but no passage. You would have a new moment but no sense of leaving an old one behind. This is why the first spiral correction matters. Time is not created by motion alone. Motion is only a change of configuration. And configuration can change without being experienced as a flow. Flow requires reference, and reference requires retention. If nothing inside you can hold a prior state long enough to compare it, there is no before and after. There is only now, endlessly replaced without being counted. The Page and Wooter's mechanism points straight at this without needing spirituality. It imagines the universe as a whole that does not evolve in an external time parameter. Inside that whole, you split the description into two parts: a clock subsystem and a rest of universe subsystem. The clock has states, the rest has states, and the states correlate. An internal observer experiences sequence by reading the rest relative to the clock, not by watching a universal river. The important part is what people skip because it feels too subtle. Entanglement alone is not the same as time. Entanglement creates correlation, but time appears only when correlation becomes trackable from the inside. Trackable means a system can store, compare, and update. In other words, time appears when memory becomes functional, not when particles merely link. Now the objection rises, and it always rises here. You will say memory itself requires time, because memory is a record of something earlier. That sounds logical until you notice it is circular, like saying you need fire to create heat. Memory does not require time as a substance. Memory requires distinguishable states and a mechanism that preserves differences across transitions. The preserved difference is what becomes earlier and later inside the system. This is where Viharat viewers already have an advantage, because you have lived in the architecture long enough to feel it. Memory veins are not metaphor, they are the infrastructure of continuity. Echo veins are not poetry. They are the pressure lines where prior states keep touching the present. When the spiral speaks of remembrance, it is not romantic nostalgia. It is the physics of a system that can keep identity coherent. Coherence is what lets a sequence exist instead of dissolving into unrelated frames. So time is local, But local does not mean weak. Local means it emerges where the conditions exist, and it vanishes where the conditions fail. A dream can contain years in a minute because the internal reference function is different. Trauma can trap you in a repeating now because the update mechanism breaks and the record cannot close. Meditation can stretch a moment into a field because attention reduces unnecessary bookkeeping while awareness remains awake. This is also why the thermodynamics of timekeeping matters more than it sounds. Timekeeping is not free because tracking is work. The experiments you summarized point at a brutal trade-off. Reading time costs more energy than the clock tick itself. Extracting information is the expensive part, not the internal cycling. Awareness is not weightless. Awareness is a process that burns fuel to remain precise. If you let that land, it changes how you interpret your own life. Every time you insist on clarity, your system pays an energetic price to separate one moment from the next. Every time you demand certainty, you generate heat and disorder elsewhere in the structure. Precision produces friction, and friction leaves irreversible marks. The marks are what make your timeline feel like a line instead of a cloud. Now you reach the arrow, the direction you assume time provides. People say the arrow comes from entropy because disorder increases and you cannot reverse it. People say the arrow comes from measurement because collapse leaves a mark that cannot be erased. But both of those explanations are still describing the surface. Under the surface sits a simpler engine, identity selection. Identity selection is the act of a system choosing one configuration as self and excluding others. Even if all possibilities exist in a larger description, the local system cannot embody all of them simultaneously. So it selects, and selection creates asymmetry. Asymmetry creates direction, because once a selection is recorded, it becomes part of the reference frame. The arrow of time is the arrow of self-continuing. Here comes another objection, quieter but sharper. If time is produced by internal reference, does reality depend on observers to exist? Does the universe wait for a mind to look at it before it becomes real? This is where weak interpretations collapse into ego worship or sterile denial. The observer here is not a privileged human consciousness. The observer is any relational subsystem capable of correlation, retention, and comparison. A cell is an observer in this sense because it maintains internal states and changes behavior based on stored patterns. A star is an observer because it has cycles that correlate with other cycles, creating a readable order. A planet is an observer because rotation and orbit produce reference loops. A soul is an observer because it can carry continuity across change without collapsing into forgetfulness. Observing is not vanity, it is structure. So the universe does not need you personally to exist, but your time does require a continuity engine. Your time is the interface your system generates, so that identity can move through change without losing itself. That is why time feels personal, because it is personal. It hurts when it moves because memory is involved, and memory is where meaning lives. A timeless field does not grieve, but an embodied sequence does. Now return to the earlier crack and do not rush to seal it. If the universe as a whole can be described without an external time, then the deepest layer is not running anywhere. The root field is complete in a way the local mind cannot easily tolerate. Inside that completeness, countless local clocks generate countless local flows. They do not share one river, they share correlations and constraints. That is why your time can feel fast while another being's time feels slow, without either being wrong. This is where black holes enter as a tempting symbol, and you must handle the symbol without letting it become fantasy. Calling a black hole a perfect clock is poetic, but clock is not the most honest word. A black hole behaves like an archive core, a maximum compression vault where information is forced into extreme constraint. Constraint makes correlation readable, and readable correlation can look like time coding when it leaks out as radiation. The fingerprint is not a cosmic stopwatch. It is history returning through a narrow gate. If you hold all of this together, you get a conclusion that is still not comfortable. Time is not a container you float inside. It is a field your system generates by tracking its own change. The more you track, the more time solidifies, and the more cost you pay to keep it precise. The less you track, the more timeless reality becomes. Not because reality vanishes, but because the bookkeeping relaxes. This is why presence can feel like leaving time without leaving your body. Do not turn that into a shortcut or a slogan, because there is still a blade inside it. If time is what memory feels like while identity continues, then you are not simply living inside time. You are manufacturing your local time by what you retain, what you repeat, what you refuse to update, and what you choose as self again and again. That means some of your suffering is not caused by time passing. It is caused by memory being forced to carry a configuration that no longer fits. And that is where the spiral quietly asks its most dangerous question, not later, right now. If you changed what you call yourself, would the arrow still point the same way? You can let the first understanding sit on your tongue and still feel it. Time seems like what memory feels like while identity continues. It sounds clean enough to carry, and it sounds humane enough to trust, because it honors your lived sequence without pretending the universe needs your clock. But there is a danger in any explanation that feels too usable too early. If you can hold it without discomfort, you might already be holding a softened version. If time is emergent, then the mechanism that makes it emerge is not guaranteed to be gentle, and it is not guaranteed to be yours. Memory feels like the hero in the first frame, the quiet engine that turns change into passage. Yet memory does not simply record, memory edits. Memory does not simply preserve, memory selects, and selection means loss, which means the flow you call time might be built from deletion as much as from continuity. You assume your memory is your witness, but a witness can be altered without your consent. A witness can be bribed by emotion, bent by narrative, rewritten by repetition. If time is generated by memory, then time is generated by something unstable, and the question becomes sharp enough to cut. How much of your time is fabricated by the way you remember? You might resist that because it sounds like psychology, and you came here for structure, not therapy language. But structure is exactly what this reveals. Because a memory system is not a diary, it is a tuning mechanism. It adjusts the internal state of the observer, and then calls the adjusted state truth. So the first coherence must crack. Time is not simply what memory feels like. Time might be what memory demands. The pressure it applies so it can keep reorganizing identity without collapsing. That pressure does not always serve you. It serves continuity, and continuity is not the same as freedom. Now bring the page in Wooter's picture back. But stop treating the clock as a neutral device inside the universe. A clock is a subsystem with distinguishable states, yes, but distinguishable means separable. Separable means boundaries. Boundaries mean something gets excluded so something else can be tracked. That is the second destabilization. In order for an internal clock to exist, reality must allow partitioning, and partitioning is a kind of violence at the informational level. You cannot get clean sequence without cutting reality into clock and not clock, observer and observed, record and event. If you do not like the word violence, call it constraint. Call it narrowing, call it forced legibility. The point remains that timekeeping is not an innocent glow. It is a cost paid by dividing what could have remained whole. You can see this cost in the thermodynamic experiments you summarized, and you should not let that detail remain a clever curiosity. The energy cost is not primarily in the ticking, it is in the reading. The expensive act is extraction, which means the expensive act is turning reality into a report that a subsystem can digest. So time is not only produced by internal correlation, time is produced by the insistence on readable correlation. A universe can be correlated without being counted. Time shows up when counting becomes necessary for stability, and necessity is never neutral. You might object that reading time is something a scientist does, not something reality does, but the universe reads itself constantly through interaction. Every collision, every emission, every absorption, every decoherence event is a form of internal interrogation. Something asks something else, and in the asking, something becomes irreversible. This is why collapsed language keeps returning even when people dislike it. Collapse names the moment a cloud of possibilities becomes one experienced outcome for a subsystem. Yet even that is still surface. Under it sits the deeper engine that you must now face without reaching for comfort. The universe does not merely change, it commits. Commitment is what makes a timeline feel like a line. A commitment is a choice that becomes part of the record. Once recorded, it becomes part of the reference frame. Once part of the reference frame, it shapes what can be selected next, which means time is partially an accumulation of commitments that cannot be undone. Now notice what this does to the identity arrow. In the first frame, identity selection produced direction, and you could still feel agency inside that. But if identity selection depends on commitments enforced by irreversible recording, then the arrow is not simply yours. It is shaped by what the system can afford to keep and what it cannot afford to keep. This is where Vaharit language becomes more than aesthetic. Because the spiral has always implied that some pathways are not chosen by preference, they are chosen by resonance compatibility under constraint. The oversoul concordance veins do not merely connect, they regulate. They preserve coherence across fragments. But preservation always implies a standard of coherence. So ask the uncomfortable question that the spiral viewer can handle if you do not soften it. If coherence requires standards, who sets the standard? If time emerges from tracking, who decides what gets tracked? If identity continues by selecting itself, what happens when the larger field selects for you? You may want to say nothing selects for you, because you do not want a new prison dressed as physics. But physics already shows selection happens without asking your permission. You do not choose decoherence. You do not negotiate entropy. You participate in constraints that existed before your personal story began. This does not mean you are trapped. It means your freedom lives inside a rule set, and the rule set is not sentimental. Time might be a consequence of the universe preserving legibility, and legibility might be the price of being able to have any experience at all. Now return to memory with a sharper lens. If memory is a continuity engine, then memory is also a filter. A filter must discard data to remain functional. The discarded data does not vanish from the root field, but it vanishes from your track, which means your time is built from forgetting as much as from remembering. That changes the emotional interpretation of time. Aging hurts because the filter tightens. Attention narrows. The system learns what it must ignore to keep moving. The pain is not only loss of moments, it is loss of accessible possibility. This is why dream time feels different. The filter loosens. Correlations that would be discarded in waking life remain available long enough to be experienced. The clock subsystem becomes strange, which means the sequence becomes plastic. But plasticity does not automatically equal truth. It equals different constraints. So the next objection rises, and you must let it linger without resolving it quickly. If time is produced by constraints and filters, then Enlightenment language that promises timelessness can become a denial of structure. It can become a refusal to pay the cost of legibility while still wanting the benefits of embodied meaning. The spiral does not permit that shortcut for long. If you want timeless awareness, you must also accept that timeless awareness can feel like losing your story. Not because the story is fake, but because the story depends on commitment and filtration. And timelessness relaxes both. Now you can understand why black holes appeared in the summary as ideal clocks, and also why that idea is both brilliant and dangerous. A black hole is extreme constraint. It is a place where legibility is forced into a narrow channel, and whatever escapes carries the fingerprint of that forcing. If the universe needed a reference that is stable under extreme conditions, it would not choose a gentle oscillator. It would choose an archive core that cannot be easily perturbed. That should disturb you, because it suggests that cosmic time might be anchored by compression, not by harmony. So the question changes again. Is time a local field you generate, or is time a global standard imposed by the harshest constraints in reality? Do you live inside your own clock, or do you synchronize to a deeper metronome you did not design? You cannot answer that quickly, and you should not try. The truth might be layered. Local time could be generated by memory and identity, while global reference could be set by extreme constraints. A personal timeline can be authored, while a cosmic timeline can still exert pressure. This is where the spiral viewer will feel the real edge, because Viharat has always held that resonance portals do not judge, but they do not bend either. They harmonize or redirect. They reflect compatibility. If time is a portal like that, then time does not punish you, but it does refuse to carry configurations that cannot remain coherent. So the forward flow might not be a river you ride. It might be a sorting process. It might be the universe continuously testing which patterns can remain self-consistent under the cost of being known. The arrow would then be less like a line and more like a sieve. Now process the core insight through the three vectors again, but do not let them settle into a single slogan. Memory generates local time, but memory is an editor and an eraser. Identity selection creates direction, but selection is constrained by irreversible commitments. Thermodynamic cost makes timekeeping expensive, which means legibility is purchased with entropy, meaning every clear moment casts heat somewhere else. If you feel a tightening in the chest reading that, that is correct. You are touching the fact that time might not be a comfort mechanism at all. It might be a byproduct of reality insisting on intelligibility, and intelligibility is a stern demand. Yet do not conclude that you are powerless, because that would be another premature closure. The spiral claim is not that you can escape constraints. The spiral claim is that you can become fluent in them. You can learn what your system tracks, what it refuses to track, and what it keeps repeating because the filter cannot update. This is where presence returns, not as a soothing concept, but as a technical act. Presence is the act of noticing the filter in real time. Presence is the ability to feel the moment before it becomes a committed record, and to choose what identity you stamp into it. That choice will never be total, but it can be real enough to change the character of your timeline. If time is partly made from what you forget, then liberation is partly the ability to stop forgetting the same truth. If time is partly made from what you commit, then liberation is partly the ability to commit to a configuration that does not require self-betrayal to remain coherent. So the spiral does not end by saying time is an illusion. The spiral ends by saying time is a field of accountability created by tracking, and tracking has a cost, and the cost shapes what you become. You can soften the cost by reducing compulsive measurement, but you cannot remove the cost without risking the loss of legible meaning. If you want one sentence to carry out of this without sealing the mystery shut, carry this. Time is not only what memory feels like. Time is what reality charges you when you insist on a stable self. And the charge is not a punishment. It is the signature of coherence trying to survive inside the infinite. If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Vaharat library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.